In the year 1872, the town of Springfield, Massachusetts, was a place where the past and future seemed to meet in uneasy harmony. The streets were lined with red brick houses, the kind built to last through harsh winters, their chimneys constantly spilling thin columns of smoke into the gray skies. Horse-drawn carriages rattled over the cobblestones, and at night the town fell into a silence so deep that even the faintest sound of a creaking floorboard could travel through the dark. It was a time when science was pushing its way into people's lives, telegraphs, railroads, industry. But there was also a growing hunger for mystery, for answers about life and death that the modern world had yet to explain. Spiritualism was spreading like a fever, promising the grieving and the curious that voices from the other side could, in fact, be reached in the Crawford household. Just outside the town's edge, life carried on with a strange mixture of old-fashioned order and whispered unease. The house itself was modest, 2 stories tall with faded white shutters, sitting back from the road behind a row of elm trees that always seemed to sway harder than the rest whenever the wind picked up. Inside lived a family that, to most eyes, appeared respectable, even enviable. The father, Henry Crawford, was a man known for his strict manner, the kind of presence that filled a room without words. The mother, Margaret, was quieter but carried an edge of tension in everything she did, as though she were waiting for something unseen to happen. Their daughter, Emily, was 14 years old that spring, a child on the border of womanhood, with pale eyes that seemed to notice more than they should. To neighbors, the Crawfords looked like any other family. They went to church every Sunday. Henry kept a careful ledger of his work as a bookkeeper, and Margaret managed the house with a precise hand. Millie attended school, though teachers often remarked on her absent stares, her way of drifting off mid-lesson as if pulled by thoughts too heavy for her age. None of these things, taken on their own, seemed strange. But when pieced together, there was something unsettled about them, something that made people whisper once they thought the family was out of earshot. The town itself was already stirred by talk of séances and mediums, and many households had stories of knocking sounds in the night, flickering lamps, or shadows that didn't belong. It was a subject that sat somewhere between entertainment and deep belief. The wealthy hosted parlor gatherings where mediums claimed to call back loved ones, while ordinary families paid pennies to traveling clairvoyants who set up in taverns. For some, it was a way to ease grief. For others, it was a game. But underneath it all lay fear, the unspoken truth that everyone wanted life to mean more than what it appeared to be. Emily was different from the other children. She didn't laugh as much and didn't run about in the yard as freely. Instead, she would sit by the window with her small hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on things no one else could see. Her voice, when she spoke, was soft, almost hesitant, as though each word had to be pulled out from somewhere deeper than her own mind. Margaret often grew uneasy watching her daughter like this. Sometimes, at night, she would find Emily standing in the hallway, eyes wide, whispering into the darkness as if someone had just walked past her. Henry dismissed it as childish imagination, the sort of thing that would fade with age, but Margaret wasn't so sure. The first real signs that something unusual lingered in the Crawford home came in small ways. A door that shut on its own, a glass that slid from one end of the table to the other without being touched. The family tried to ignore these things, convincing themselves that drafts or clumsy hands were to blame. Yet Emily's expression always betrayed her. She looked as if she knew what was happening, as if she was caught between fear and acceptance of it. Outside their walls, the Crawfords were respected but not loved. Henry's sternness kept neighbors at a distance, and Margaret's tense demeanor gave little room for warmth. Emily was the exception. Children were drawn to her quiet strangeness, curious about the girl who claimed she could hear things others couldn't. Some dared her to prove it, and though she never spoke of it openly, there were moments when her eyes filled with a knowledge far beyond her years, and those same children went running home in fright. There were also tensions within the home that no neighbor could see. Henry's authority weighed heavily on Margaret and Emily, his word rarely challenged, his silence more cutting than anger. Margaret carried the burden of obity. NCE, her life reduced to routine and duty, while Emily grew into a girl who learned to keep her thoughts hidden. Beneath their roof, there was little room for softness, and the air often felt thick with unspoken words. Yet something darker was building, something none of them could name. The balance between what was ordinary and what was not grew thinner each day, like ice spreading cracks underfoot. Emily herself became the center of this fragile tension, her presence both unsettling and magnetic. She was in many ways the mirror of the time they lived in, caught between faith and doubt, between control and chaos, between the known and the unknown. By the summer of 1872, Springfield would no longer see the Crawfords as just another family on the edge of town. Rumors would grow, stories would twist, and people would whisper the name Emily Crawford with fear. Before any of that, though, there was only this fragile picture, a stern father, a weary mother, and a girl whose silence seemed to listen to voices no one else could hear. The air around them already carried the weight of something waiting to happen, though no one could yet say what it was. But those who stepped inside their house always left with the same feeling, like the walls themselves were holding back secrets, and that one day they would break loose. The Crawford household began to feel like a place wound too tightly, as if every sound and silence carried more weight than it should. By the late months of 1872, the tension that once lingered in small, uneasy moments started to build into something stronger, a current pulling them all toward an end no one could stop. At the center of it was Emily, no longer just the quiet, unusual girl by the window, but something more unsettling. Her presence had begun to shift the balance inside the house and beyond it, turning curiosity into fear and doubt into obsession. The first sparks of trouble showed themselves in Henry Crawford's growing unease with his daughter's behavior. He had always been a man who valued control, who believed in order above all else. To him, Emily's soft, strange manner had been little more than a childish weakness. But now she was no longer a child. 14 had stretched her taller, her features sharper, her eyes carrying an intensity that unsettled him. When she spoke of things she should not know, an old neighbor's sickness before anyone had been told, or the exact words her mother had whispered in the kitchen while she was upstairs, Henry's jaw would tighten, his hand gripping the arm of his chair until his knuckles whitened. He could not name it, but he felt his authority slipping each time his daughter opened her mouth. Margaret, meanwhile, found herself pulled in two directions. She feared Henry's anger, but she also feared the silence that followed his anger even more. When Emily whispered to her at night, telling her that someone is standing in the corner, Margaret's skin crawled with terror, but she could not bring herself to hush her. There was a fragile intimacy between mother and daughter in those moments, though Margaret never admitted it aloud. For the first time, she felt Emily was confiding in her alone, as if they shared a secret. He excluded Henry, and secrets, in that house, were dangerous things. Outside the family, talk about Emily began to spread faster. A few children whispered that she had told them things about their own families, private matters, words spoken behind closed doors. A boy said she had known his dog would die before it happened. A girl swore Emily had spoken in a voice that wasn't hers during a game of hide and seek. Whether these stories were true or not hardly mattered. They caught like fire among neighbors who were already suspicious. Soon, mothers warned their children not to linger near the Crawford house, and fathers shook their heads at Henry behind his back, muttering about the devil's influence. Henry, who cared deeply for appearances, heard these rumors in the market and felt his reputation shrink by the day. Money only made matters worse. Henry's work as a bookkeeper had grown uncertain after his employer faced debts of his own. The ledgers he kept showed more red than black, and his temper flared as the household accounts grew tighter. Margaret tried to stretch every coin, sewing until her fingers bled, but it was never enough to satisfy him. In his mind, the whispers about his daughter and the cracks in his finances were tied together, each proof that his household was slipping out of his command. He began to see Emily not just as a strange girl, but as a threat, something he could not manage, something he could not bend to his will. Emily herself seemed to sense the weight pressing in. At school, She sat silent through lessons, her pale gaze fixed on things no one else noticed. Once, when asked to read aloud, she froze mid-sentence, staring at the ceiling as if she saw something crawling there. The other children laughed at first, but the laughter quickly turned nervous when she whispered, "He's here again." She was punished for disrupting the class, but afterward, RD, her teacher, wrote a discreet note to the Crawfords, urging them to take the girl to a doctor or a priest. Margaret tore the note before Henry could see it, hiding it at the bottom of the stove's fire. Yet she, too, was growing afraid. Emily had begun to keep a small notebook, its pages filled with uneven scrawls. When Margaret stole a glance, she found strange phrases. "They watch me when I sleep." "The man by the door does not blink." "Mother should be careful with knives." The handwriting was frantic, the words carrying a sense of urgency that left her cold. She tried to confront Emily about it, but the girl only closed the book and whispered, "You wouldn't understand." There were other incidents, each one more unsettling than the last. A plate shattered in the kitchen, though no one touched it. Doors locked from the inside when no one was there. One night, the family woke to find every chair in the dining room turned upside down. Henry accused Emily of playing tricks, his voice shaking with fury, but Margaret couldn't believe her frail daughter could move such heavy furniture alone. Emily said nothing. She only looked at her father with those pale eyes, and for the first time, Henry had to turn away as autumn deepened. The pressure inside the house mirrored the cold pressing in from outside. Emily began to speak more openly about the voices she heard. She told Margaret that they warned her of danger, that they spoke of things that had not yet happened. She whispered that her father would try to silence her, though she would not say how. Margaret felt torn apart, fear of her husband clashing with a desperate need to protect her daughter. She began to slip food into Emily's room, small offerings when Henry wasn't watching, as if she feared he might one day withhold even that. Henry, on the other hand, found himself haunted by a sense of being mocked. He could feel the neighbors' eyes on him in church, heard the weight of their gossip in the pause of conversations when he entered a room. His own home no longer obeyed him. His wife seemed distant, his daughter defiant in her silence. Each night he sat in his chair, his ledger before him, the numbers slipping from his mind as he heard faint whispers echoing from upstairs. Sometimes he would slam his fist on the table, shouting at Margaret to keep the girl quiet. Other times he would retreat in his silence, so deep it frightened her more than his anger. And yet, beneath all of this, there was something almost magnetic about Emily's growing power. Children who once feared her returned, daring one another to speak with her, to ask her to predict their futures. She frightened them, but she also fascinated them. A few adults, too, began to wonder if perhaps the girl had a gift. They came to Margaret in secret, asking if Emily might hold a séance for them, if she might call back a lost child, a dead parent. Margaret refused them each time, but the idea planted itself in her mind. What if Emily truly could? What if her daughter's strange gift could bring them respect instead of shame? That thought alone was enough to deepen the crack already splitting the household. Margaret began to imagine ways Emily's abilities might free them from financial worry, while Henry clung harder to his control, determined to stamp out what he saw as a weakness or worse, a curse. Emily stood between them like a shadow, stretching wider each day, her quiet gaze reflecting everything they tried to hide from one another. By the time winter crept in, the Crawfords were no longer the respectable family on the edge of town. They were a house whispered about, a place children dared each other to approach after dark. Inside, the air was thick with silence and suspicion, with a father's rage, a mother's fear, and a daughter's unsettling calm. The line between what was real and what was imagined blurred more each day. And though no one yet knew it, every argument, every whisper, every slammed door was pulling them closer to a moment that could not be undone. The breaking point was near. The night of the crime was cold, the kind of biting chill that pressed through the walls and made every breath feel heavier. The Crawford home, dimly lit by oil lamps, carried an air of exhaustion and dread. Margaret had spent the evening in silence, sewing by the fire with trembling fingers, while Henry sat at the table, staring at his ledge, though the numbers no longer made sense. Emily lingered near the stairs, her pale eyes reflecting the faint glow of the lamp, as though she were both present and elsewhere at the same time. The house itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what was to come. Tea began with an argument, though arguments had become so common that Margaret hardly lifted her eyes at first. Henry slammed his hand against the table, demanding to know what Emily had told the neighbor boy earlier that day. A story had reached him, that his daughter had whispered something about a death in the family that had not yet happened. To Henry, this was humiliation sharpened to a point. He could not bear the thought of his child making him a laughingstock, of their name being tied to whispers of curses and madness. His voice rose, thick with rage, calling her a liar, a fraud, a disgrace. Emily did not shout back. She stood at the bottom of the staircase, her small hands gripping the wooden railing. Her face calm in a way that only angered him more. When he demanded she answer him, she whispered, "You cannot silence them. They will not leave." The words seemed to freeze the room. Margaret's needle slipped from her hand, falling into her lap, and Henry's face twisted into something darker than anger, something closer to fear. He crossed the room in heavy steps, his shadow stretching across the floor. Margaret rose from her chair, her voice breaking as she begged him to stop, but he did not hear her. To Henry, Emily was no longer his daughter, but the embodiment of every failure, every humiliation, every sleepless night. He reached for her, his hand gripping her arm with a force that made her wince. Emily's lips moved in a whisper too faint to catch, her eyes fixed not on him, but on something behind him, something only she could see. That sight, his daughter staring past him as though he were nothing, ignited a fury he could not contain. The moment broke with a crash. Whether it was the lamp falling, Margaret's desperate attempt to intervene, or Henry's sudden loss of control, no one could say clearly afterward. The lamp tumbled from the table, spilling oil across the wooden floor, the flame leaping like a living thing. Margaret screamed, her hands pulling at Henry's arm, but his grip only tightened. In a blur of rage, he struck Emily, her head hitting the wooden stair post with a sickening crack that silenced the room. For a heartbeat, everything froze. The flicker of firelight, the ragged sound of breath, the sight of Emily collapsing against the stairs, the house filled with smoke and the acrid smell of burning oil. Margaret fell to her knees beside Emily, her hands shaking as she touched her daughter's pale face. Blood ran in a thin line from her temple, soaking into her hair. Emily's eyes fluttered open for a brief moment, unfocused, her lips moving without sound. Margaret bent low, desperate to hear, but whatever words came out were too soft, too fleeting. And then her body stilled, her chest no longer rising. Henry staggered back, his face drained of color. His chest rose and fell with violent breaths, his hands trembling as if he no longer recognized them as his own. The rage that had consumed him only moments before drained into horror. He looked at Margaret cradling their daughter's body, her cries breaking through the crackle of flames beginning to spread across the floor. For the first time in years, Henry had no words. His lips parted, but nothing came out, only the sound of his breath, shallow and panicked. Margaret screamed at him, her voice raw, accusing. She called him a murderer, cursed his name, and cursed the day she had bound herself to him. She tried to drag Emily's limp body away from the fire, but her hands were weak, shaking, desperate. Henry, in his shock, finally rushed to hell. Lifting Emily as if she weighed nothing at all. Together they pulled her to the far side of the room, away from the spreading flames, though her body was already beyond saving. The room filled with chaos. Smoke, firelight, sobs, and silence all at once. Henry poured water over the fire until it hissed and died, leaving the house in darkness save for the faint glow of the embers. The smell of smoke clung to everything, searing itself into memory. In the dim silence that followed, Henry stood staring at Emily's body, laid out on the rug, his shoulders heaving, his mind splintering under the weight of what he had done. Margaret rocked back and forth beside her daughter, whispering prayers through broken sobs. She could not bring herself to look at Henry. Her grief turned quickly to a kind of sharp clarity, a realization that she could never forgive him, that she could never live under his roof again. Her silence cut deeper than any word, and Henry felt it like a blade pressed against his chest. In the hours that followed, denial wrapped itself around him. He muttered to himself that it was an accident, that he hadn't meant it, that Emily had slipped, that it was the fire's fault. He paced the room, running his hands through his hair, his eyes wild with confusion. Margaret did not answer him. She stayed on the floor, holding Emily's still hand, whispering to her as though she could call her back. The house that night was a tomb, every corner heavy with what had just happened. The fire had scarred the wooden floor, a black stain spreading beneath the rug, but the greater mark was the silence of a girl who once whispered to shadows and now lay still, her voice forever gone. Henry's mind turned in frantic circles, searching for a way to undo what could not be undone. He thought of the neighbors, the gossip, the shame that would come when they learned. He thought of the law, the gallows, the finality of justice. His hand shook as he touched the blood-stained stair, his breath catching in his throat. For the first time, he felt small, powerless, trapped by a fate he had tried so hard to control that Margaret's grief hardened into something colder. She no longer wept aloud. Instead, she sat with Emily's body in silence, her eyes hollow, her face pale as ash. When Henry tried to speak to her, she did not answer. She only turned her gaze on him once, and the hatred in her eyes made him recoil. The crime had unfolded in moments, but its weight would stretch across the rest of their lives. The Crawford home, once whispered about for its strangeness, would now be remembered for something far darker. And as dawn crept closer, painting the smoke-stained walls with pale light, the Crawfords stood at the edge of ruin, their lives shattered in a single night of rage and silence. Morning came heavy to the Crawford house. The pale light crept through smoke-stained curtains, touching every scar left behind from the night before. The smell of fire still clung to the air, mixed with the faint, metallic tang of blood that no scrubbing could wash away. Emily's body lay still in the parlor, covered with a thin sheet Margaret had placed over her during the long, silent hours of the night. Nothing about the room looked like a home anymore. It felt like the shell of something broken, a place where the air itself seemed unwilling to move. Henry sat in the kitchen with his head in his hands, muttering fragments of sentences that tripped over themselves. His mind worked in circles, rehearsing excuses, stitching together half-truths that might explain away what had happened. It was the fire, he whispered to himself. She fell. She slipped on the oil. The words tumbled again and again, as if repetition could make them real. His hands trembled with every thought of what would come next. The neighbors, the sheriff, the shame of standing before the town. He clung to denial as though it were a shield, refusing to let the truth settle in fully. Margaret did not share his denial. She sat by Emily's side, her eyes hollow, her face so pale it seemed carved from stone. The tears had dried hours before, leaving her with something harder, sharper than grief. She no longer screamed or wept. She whispered prayers under her breath, her fingers brushing her daughter's lifeless hand, but inside her chest grew a knot of hatred that burned hotter than any flame that had scorched the floor. She could not look at Henry without feeling her stomach turn. To her, he was no longer a husband, but a murderer, a man who had destroyed the only light left in her life. The town soon learned what had happened. The smoke rising from the Crawford house had been seen in the night, and by morning, the whispers spread faster than the truth could. Neighbors crowded near the gate, their faces pale with curiosity and fear. Some said the devil had taken the girl. Others muttered that Henry's temper had finally spilled over. A few shook their heads in pity for Margaret, though most did not dare approach her door. Springfield, already a place of suspicion and rumor, now carried a story too terrible to ignore. When the sheriff arrived, he found Henry standing stiff and defensive, insisting over and over that Emily had fallen, that the lamp had tipped, that it was all a terrible accident. His words came quickly, desperately, almost frantically, but his eyes betrayed him. Margaret, when questioned, said little. She told the sheriff only that Emily had suffered under her father's hand, and that the truth would reveal itself. Her silence carried more weight than Henry's frantic explanations, and the sheriff left with a look that said he already knew which story he believed. The days that followed bled into each other, heavy with grief and suspicion. Emily's burial was quiet, attended by only a handful of neighbors. The church bells tolled in slow, mournful rhythm, though even the prayers spoken over her grave carried an air of unease. Children who had once been curious about Emily now whispered about her in fear, saying her spirit would not rest, that she would return to haunt the man who had struck her down. The Crawfords stood apart during the burial, Margaret at the edge of the grave, her face rigid and unreadable, Henry a few paces away, shifting with restless guilt, unable to meet anyone's eyes. For Henry, the aftermath was a prison of his own making. He spent his days pacing the house, snapping at shadows, insisting he heard voices in the hall. He told himself they were echoes of Margaret's sobs, but sometimes, late at night, he swore he heard Emily's whisper, soft, accusing, calling his name. His guilt twisted into paranoia, and the walls of the house closed in tighter with each passing day. He still clung to the story of an accident, rehearsing it as though he might one day stand before a judge, but deep down he knew the truth pressed against him with every breath, that Margaret's grief transformed her into something unrecognizable. She no longer moved through the house as a wife, but as a ghost herself, her every motion deliberate, her silence heavy. She began to avoid Henry entirely, sleeping in a separate room, keeping her words few and sharp. Her heart carried only two things now: the weight of her daughter's absence and the fire of her hatred for the man who caused it. She prayed less for Emily's peace and more for Henry's punishment. The community's perception shifted quickly. Once seen as stern but respectable, Henry became the subject of open scorn. Men in the market avoided his eyes, women whispered behind their hands, and children crossed to the other side of the street when he passed. The Crawfords' once solid name was stained beyond repair, and there was no ledger Henry could balance to erase it. Margaret, meanwhile, found herself pitied by some, admired by others who whispered she had the strength to outlast the cruelty she endured. But pity did not soothe her. It only deepened the cold inside her. The psychological toll spread beyond the family. Friends who once visited their home avoided it now, uneasy about stepping inside walls that had held so much violence. The air around the Crawford place seemed heavier, and stories grew. Some claimed they saw Emily's shadow in the upstairs window. Others swore they heard her laughter at night. Whether true or not, the house became a place of fear, and the family within it a cautionary tale. Henry tried, at times, to reach Margaret, to plead for her forgiveness, to insist he had not meant to hurt Emily. But each word he spoke only deepened the distance between them. Margaret looked at him with eyes that no longer held any trace of love, only judgment. He could not stand that gaze, and yet he could not escape it, for it followed him through every room, every silence. The law loomed closer with each passing week. Though no formal charges were brought immediately, the whispers reached the ears of those with power. The sheriff returned often, asking questions, pressing Henry for details, his voice calm, but his eyes sharp. Henry felt the weight of the gallows in each visit, the rope tightening around his neck long before it was placed there. He tried to find solace in his routines, his ledgers, his numbers, but nothing could restore order. His home was chaos, his name was shame, and his nights were haunted. Margaret, though shattered by grief, began to rebuild herself on the ashes. Her hatred for Henry gave her a strange kind of strength. She spoke less, but when she did, her words cut cleanly. She no longer flinched at his anger. She no longer tried to calm him. She had nothing left to lose, and that gave her a power Henry could not take from her. In the end, the Crawford home was no longer a place of family, but a ruin of human weakness. Fear, anger, guilt, and silence all tangled into one. The crime had stripped away every L. air of respectability, exposing the raw, fragile truth beneath. Emily was gone, yet her presence lingered in every shadow, every whisper, every sleepless night. And for those left behind, there was no peace, only the slow, suffocating weight of what could never be undone. The story of Emily Crawford did not end with the blow of the candlestick, nor with the panic that followed in the parlor that night. It stretched out into months of hearings, whispered testimony, and headlines that carried her name across London. The girl once known for her strange gift, for her pale face bent over flickering candles, became something else in the eyes of the public, a cautionary tale. The court judged her not only for the death of Charles Redgrave, but for the life she had lived before it. Every séance, every whispered message from the dead, was laid bare as evidence of deceit and manipulation. Witnesses painted her as a fraud, a girl who had toyed with grief for profit. Others, more sympathetic, spoke of her as a victim, too young, too easily controlled by a mother who pushed her into the role of medium when she had no choice. But the court was less interested in sympathy than in order. Spiritualism was already a thorn in the side of the church and the state, and Redgrave's death provided the perfect weapon against it. Emily was sentenced to years of confinement, not the gallows as some had feared, but a prison where her youth and frailty would be tested daily. For her, it was both a reprieve and a slow punishment. Behind iron bars, she no longer faced the greedy eyes of strangers, the burning touch of men like Redgrave, or her mother's demands. Yet she also carried the solitude of her crime, the endless replaying of that moment, and the weight of knowing her life had been sealed by a single desperate act. Her mother's world unraveled quickly after the trial. Branded as an enabler, she was shunned by neighbors and abandoned by those who had once sought her daughter's talents. She fought to keep the household afloat, but debts mounted, and the shame that clung to her name made survival harder with each passing month. She grew harsher with her sons, more brittle with each setback. Her once iron will corroded by bitterness and loss. Her father never recovered from the scandal. Already weakened, he seemed to shrink into himself completely, his bitterness souring in his silence until illness carried him away. Her brothers scattered, one leaving London altogether, the other falling into petty crime. The Crawford family, once bound by necessity, fractured under the weight of what had been done in that parlor. For the wider community, the case left scars of its own. Spiritualist circles, once eager to claim Emily as proof of their beliefs, quickly distanced themselves, denouncing her as a fraud. Preachers seized on her downfall, filling pulpits with warnings against false prophets and the dangers of meddling with the unseen. Parlors that once brimmed with eager sitters grew quiet, as families reconsidered the risks of putting their trust in girls who claimed to speak for the dead. Yet, beneath the condemnations and moralizing, there was also a quieter undercurrent of unease. Many have felt something real in Emily's presence, something they could not explain. For them, her fall did not erase the comfort she had once brought, nor the hope her words had kindled. But the line between belief and deception was now blurred beyond repair, leaving grief-stricken families more isolated than before. Emily herself faded from the public's eye once the trial was done. Rumors trickled out of the prison walls, that she grew sickly, that she spent her days in silence, that she spoke only to herself as though still carrying on conversations with the dead. Some said she repented, begging forgiveness in endless prayers. Others insisted she clung to her visions, claiming she still saw and heard what no one else could. Whether she lived long or died young, the world seemed to lose interest in the details, satisfied to let her name become a ghost story whispered in London's alleys. The question of justice remained unsettled. To some, her punishment was too light, a mockery of the life she had taken. To others, it was too heavy, cruel for a girl who had lashed out in terror against a man who would not release her. The truth lay somewhere in between, tangled in the complexities of human fear, desperation, and survival. What happened in that parlor was not the act of a cold-blooded killer, nor the workings of a pure innocent, but the collision of power and helplessness, of exploitation and resistance, that left blood on the floor and a life destroyed. Her story became less about one girl and more about the world that shaped her. It showed how easily the vulnerable could be used, how grief could be twisted into opportunity, and how quickly a community could turn from belief to condemnation. It revealed the dangers of power imbalances between men and women, parents and children, the wealthy and the poor. And it forced uncomfortable questions about morality. Whether survival could excuse deception, whether fear could justify violence, whether society itself bore some share of guilt for creating the conditions that led to tragedy. In the end, Emily Crawford's life was a mirror held up to her time. It reflected a society both fascinated and terrified by the unseen, a city where desperation made people cling to hope in the strangest of places, and where the weight of expectation could crush even the youngest shoulders. Her fall was not only her own, but that of everyone who had placed her on the fragile pedestal of belief, demanding comfort from a girl who could barely carry herself. Her name faded into history, but the questions remained, echoing long after the parlor fell silent. What is truth when grief clouds the mind? What is justice when power twists it to serve its own ends? And how much can one fragile life bear before it breaks beneath the weight of others' demands? Emily's story did not offer easy answers, only the reminder that behind every headline, every whispered rumor, there is always a human heart, fragile, flawed, and caught in the merciless grip of circumstance.